Here we are in 2025, and the original Nintendo Entertainment System, released in 1985, will soon be 40 years old. Now, what if I told you we can make a nearly brand new NES today, only needing just a few of the original components? Well, I'm here to tell you we can. Some of the most talented modders out there made a brand new motherboard using readily available new components, needing only the PPU and CPU from an original console. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how an NES can go from this to this. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. In today's episode, we're going to be building what is basically a brand new NES console. And you know what? It's a lot easier than you think. Now, this project here comes from Zaxor. He designed a brand new motherboard for the NES called the SM-Tendo. SM meaning surface mount, since pretty much all the components on the board are surface mounted. This allows for improved manufacturability since all of these will come pre-assembled. The only thing you need to provide are the PPU and CPU, which don't even need to be soldered to the board since the SM-Tendo comes with these handy sockets. Now, this project leverages work done by another familiar name in the NES modding scene, Red Herring 32, who reverse engineered the original NES motherboard a few years ago. Now, the SM-Tendo board also incorporates some tweaks to the original hardware, such as the removal of the CIC region lockout chip and the inclusion of expansion audio capabilities, something that was included only in the Japanese Famicom systems, but not the NES. Now, in addition to the SM-Tendo, in order to build a new NES, we will need an AV solution. We can either use the original RF modulator from the NES, or, since the whole point is to build a brand new console, I'm going to opt to use this, the PAL block, which was also created by Zaxor. This handy little kit provides the same composite video output capability, as well as a more efficient power circuit. Additionally, there's an extra output that we can install here where the RF port used to be. This will give us an option for a completely different video output standard. Which brings me to the next item I'll be installing in this build, which is called the PPUdigitizer. This is a completely optional mod and isn't at all needed, but once installed, it will allow you to get an extremely crisp, almost HDMI level video output quality from this single port, which I'm really excited to check out and get working. Now, to pair with the SM-Tendo board, I'll be installing the Nintendrawer, which I previously covered on the channel and is pretty much the best and most reliable way to connect games to the console, way better than the push-down mechanism on the original NES. And lastly, to really tie the whole build together, I'll be using a beautiful translucent purple injection molded shell from the folks over at Retro Gamer Store. This thing is gorgeous. Now, of course, I'll need a donor NES, and thankfully Bob from Retro RGB put me in contact with Andy, who had the perfect candidate. Yup, this thing is absolutely wrecked, like hit by a truck levels of destroyed, but luckily all the components we need to salvage should still be in good shape. Andy even included a letter with a nice backstory on the unit. Thanks Andy, rest assured this NES is getting a second chance at life. Anyway, by the time we put this all together, we'll basically have a brand new NES that's super reliable and ready for years of gaming. Now, before I start putting this all together, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. If you have an idea for a new mod or want to assemble an open source project, PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order, and again a huge thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Alright, with that out of the way, let's put together this brand new NES. Okay, so after going through all the NES pieces, we're going to start with the motherboard, which, while a bit dirty, appears to be in overall pretty good condition. Now, I'm planning to remove the expansion port, CPU, and PPU. The expansion port is a completely optional component and not necessary to install in the new SM-Tendo board. So we'll flip the board over and start removing these 3 components. I always start by adding a bit of fresh solder to the pins, which helps the overall desoldering process. Then I'll grab my Hakko desoldering gun, which makes quick work of these through-hole components. There are a ton of pins we need to desolder, so just sit back and relax. Now sometimes you may have issues removing all the solder, so typically for stubborn spots, I'll add some more fresh solder and then try again. Alright, we got the PPU and CPU. Now we just need to remove the expansion port. Again, this is completely optional. Now we can grab our brand new SM-Tendo board and start to populate it. I'm going to start by installing the expansion port. I actually found that the guide pegs on either side of the port were giving me issues fully seating the port to the motherboard, so I went ahead and clipped them off. Then I dropped in the expansion port and began to solder it in. Thankfully, we don't need to solder in the PPU and CPU since they just press fit into the pre-installed sockets, which is super convenient. It is a bit tough to get them in, but after ensuring that all the pins are aligned, just brute force them in. Alright, so the next thing we're going to install is the PPUdigitizer. This too is completely optional and not needed, but it will give us a pretty cool, high quality video output option called Lumacode, which I'm actually pretty anxious to try out. Then, taking a look at the PPU chip, we need to ensure we align the digitizer with pin 1 marked by this dimple on the chip. After you are sure it is aligned correctly, go ahead and solder it in place. Then we need to tin these 2 pads here, and then solder in the wires that came with the PAL block kit to these pads. Black goes to ground, and red goes to Luma. Fantastic, our brand new NES motherboard is complete, but we're not quite done yet. Here you can see me removing the header pins from the RF modulator from the old NES, which I'm going to use to connect the PAL block to the new motherboard. But as it turns out, you don't need to use these and instead can use either wires or something like old resistor legs, which is a far simpler approach as getting the old RF modulator removed is quite the hassle, as I found out. Anyway, the next thing I'm going to tackle is the PAL block, which is what will both power the NES and provide our video output. I'm going to start by installing this optional RCA jack, which is what the PPUdigitizer will output video through using the Lumacode standard. Next, I'll install this JST connector, which is what the cable we soldered to the PPUdigitizer will connect to, which is carrying the Lumacode video signal. Just make sure when you solder it in that the ground and Luma pins are properly oriented. I went ahead and test fitted my cable to check this. At this point, we can solder in the header pins, which will connect the PAL block to the motherboard. Again, you can use either wires or some leftover capacitor legs to do this, and you don't need the header pins from the RF modulator. Okay, the PAL block is fully assembled. Next, I'll grab the power and reset button assembly from the broken shell, and for my particular install, I'm going to replace the existing wire loom with a new one provided with the Zaxor kit, since the SM-Tendo uses a different connector. You can actually use the original wires if you want, but you will need to remove the old blue connector from the original NES motherboard and install that onto the SM-Tendo board. Either way works just fine. Now, if you install the new harness like me, just keep in mind that the colors won't match the originals. So just be cognizant where each wire goes prior to removal, or you can reference my install here. Next, grab the controller ports, and that should be everything we need from the old NES. I also went ahead and cleaned and organized all the screws and other miscellaneous parts needed to assemble our new NES. Now, it's just a matter of putting it all together. Here you can see that I'm feeding the header pins from the PAL block through to the motherboard, but I'm actually going to refrain from soldering them in until later on in the assembly to make sure I get the spacing between the two just right. One thing you should do now, however, is solder a wire from this through hole here on the PAL block to the ground plane on the motherboard. I actually forgot to do this initially, and the NES would not turn on, so make sure you do this before installing the motherboard into the shell. When plugging in the controller ports, make sure to not mix up player 1 and player 2. I did this initially and thought I messed up the installation somewhere because I had my controller plugged into player 2 thinking it was player 1. So just be sure to pay attention here. And this wire here, remember, is for our Lumacode mod coming from the PPUdigitizer. Now, one thing to note here on the top shell is that these screw posts are quite narrow, and I had a heck of a time screwing these in. I actually sheared off one of the screw heads by accident since it was so tight, so I recommend either drilling these out slightly or using some different screws that are a bit more narrow. Definitely don't make the same mistake I did, as it will be nearly impossible to remove the remains of that screw. Anyway, with everything secured, now would be a good time to solder in those header pins coming from the PAL block. And there you have it, folks, our pretty much brand new NES. Overall, I have to say that I am super impressed with the results. Taking something as beat up as the NES we started with, and coming out the other end with something like this is nothing short of amazing, and a testament to the skill, dedication, and innovation the modding community continues to pursue year after year. Regardless, let's see what this nearly brand new NES can do. Now, when it comes to features, there's really not much to it. It's basically a brand new NES. You plug in a composite cable, hook it up to the TV, and you're ready to play your games just like you would any regular old NES console. But we taught this old dog a few new tricks. Let's start with the PPUdigitizer. By installing that chip on the underside of the PPU, it allows us to use a digital video format called Lumacode. This was developed by a talented modder named Copper Dragon and was primarily made for old 8-bit consoles and retro computers. However, it has now been adapted to the NES. At a high level, the PPUdigitizer extracts the pure digital video signal from the picture processing unit of the NES, and then generates the Lumacode. However, since Lumacode isn't directly compatible with your TV, an external scaling device is needed to process and convert the signal into a format more suitable for display. As of right now, it seems one of the scalers that can process Lumacode is the OSSC loaded with the latest firmware. So that's what I'm going to use for this demonstration. Setting up the OSSC to accept Lumacode will take a bit of effort, and you will need to have a 1.8 revision or higher using firmware above 1.0. I'll leave a link in the video description that goes over how to upgrade the OSSC if your unit is lower than 1.8. Anyway, to get started, you need to connect a single RCA cable to that extra connector we soldered to the PAL block, with the other end going to the green RCA connector on the OSSC. Then turn on the OSSC and the NES. As you can see, I'm running firmware 1.11a. Now set the OSSC to AV2 YPBPR. You will definitely want to have the OSSC remote since it will make changing all the settings way easier. Okay, so at this point you can see that the NES video quality looks pretty bad, so we're going to need to change some of the settings on the OSSC. You may need to rely on the little OSSC LCD display since the video may come in and out on our main screen, not showing the on-screen display. Anyway, the first thing we need to do is go into Video in Processing. Go down to Lumacode and set it to NES. Then go back to the main menu and go to the sampling option. From here, go to Advanced Timing and set it to 256 by 240. Then press the OK button. Under sampling phase, change it to 258 degrees. Now go back to the main menu and then back to Video in Processing. Then go to the GUI offset setting and change it to 140. Then go back to the main menu again, but this time head to the Sync option setting. Here, go to ADC PLLBW and change it from high to medium. And lastly, go back to the main menu one more time and select Output option. Here, change the 240p to 88p processing setting to line 5x. And then go down to the line 5x mode and change that to 256 by 240 optimal. And now you should have a very crisp, basically HDMI quality video coming from the single wire from the NES. Honestly, it's pretty amazing how good the quality is coming from the NES through the PPUdigitizer using Lumacode. Here's a side-by-side comparison of Super Mario 3, both taken from the same NES, and the quality difference is pretty staggering. So I think it's safe to say that the PPUdigitizer is a very cool and novel way to get incredible video quality from the NES. Now, the next feature I want to talk about on this build is the Nintendrawer. Like I mentioned previously, I actually made a completely dedicated video on this mod, so if you want to check that out to learn more about it, I'll have it linked down below in the video description. But in a nutshell, it basically provides the best and most reliable cartridge connection out there, while also being easy to remove thanks to its very unique sliding action. The one I have here is actually their V2 revision, which further improves on the sliding feature by making the sled injection molded instead of 3D printed. Overall, it's a fantastic addition to any NES console, but perfect for building a brand new one in 2025. That, coupled with the absolutely beautiful and high quality injection molded NES shell from Retro Gamer Store, makes this a NES that's better than the original, while also being almost entirely brand new. All in all, these kits make building a brand new NES in 2025 possible, and also relatively simple. I cannot wait until we start seeing more mods like these come out for other consoles. Anyway, let's go over the pros and cons of this NES build. Starting with the pros, I think the biggest one by far is that mods like the SM-Tendo board give us a way to resurrect consoles that are otherwise unplayable, whether that's due to a damaged motherboard or damage to some other integral part of the console. Having an option like this keeps our retro consoles playing games for longer, which I think we can all agree is a good thing. Additionally, modern recreations of older systems can sometimes also enhance their capability beyond what they were originally designed for. For example, expansion audio, which was a feature that was only available on Japanese Famicom consoles, but is now incorporated thanks to the SM-Tendo board. And then you have new parts that fix old problems, like the unreliable spring-loaded NES cartridge slot. Projects like the Nintendrawer mean we can now have cartridges register on the first try, basically every time. And then there's the shell. Not really too much to say here, other than it's the only aftermarket option out there for the NES, but thankfully it's great quality. There is one issue, however, that I had with the shell, which brings me to the cons. Now, of course, this isn't a knock on the quality of the shell, but rather a warning to make sure you don't make the same mistake that I did. As it turns out, the screw holes are a bit too narrow for some of the original NES screws. Case in point, I accidentally broke off the screw head for the spring-loaded retaining clip for the cartridge door, and there's really no way to fix this. So I recommend either using a more narrow screw or perhaps drilling out the holes to make them a hair wider. Unfortunately, my door will now no longer stay open, which is definitely a bit inconvenient. Now, when it comes to the SM-Tendo board, I really can't think of any cons. It's such a great kit, and while basic soldering tools can be used to perform this mod, having something like the Hacko desoldering gun makes the project an absolute breeze. Additionally, the inclusion of those sockets for the PPU and CPU makes installing those chips on the new board super easy, essentially requiring no soldering to the new main board. However, there is still some minimal soldering required to assemble and attach the PAL block to the SM-Tendo. Now, when it comes to the PPUdigitizer, this is where things get a bit hairy. Getting the settings all dialed in on the OSSC is a bit finicky to get the Lumacode working, but once it's all set up, it does look really good. I am really hoping that the setup process can be done more easily with a future firmware update, but we'll have to see. And even with all the tweaking I did, thanks largely in part to the help from Marks85, there are still some artifacting which I'm sure can be removed with further tweaking. Also, the fact that it requires the OSSC to work means that's just one extra thing you need to enable this capability. It doesn't work out of the box. Now, the last thing I want to cover is the price of everything, since obviously that's really important. The SM-Tendo board will cost $65 from Zaxor, which does include the JST cable to hook up the power and reset buttons. And if you want the PAL block to go along with it, which I do strongly recommend, that'll be another $35. The PPUdigitizer is pretty pricey at around $50, but remember, this is optional and not needed for the SM-Tendo build, but still a very cool way to get ultra crisp video from the NES, especially if you do already own an OSSC. The Nintendrawer, another fantastic mod for the NES, will run you $55, and the aftermarket shell from Retro Gamer Store is the most expensive item on the list, clocking in at $110. I'll have links to all these parts down below in the video description. Anyway guys, there you have it. Building a brand new, better NES in 2025. Who would have thought? Now, if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for tuning in today, and I'll catch you again next time.